So the first thing you need to do when you're trying to demonstrate the impact of a tariff is to draw the axes. So we're using the supply and demand model. So please draw the usual axes for the supply and demand model. So price and quantity, we're going to work with the market for computers, just because that's what they use in the textbook, so that you're able to compare notes. So the computer market, and you want to draw the supply and demand curve as with any of these graphs. So supply and demand. So remember, when we draw a supply and demand curve, the supply curve and the demand curve represents domestic consumers and domestic producers. So this demand curve represents all the consumers in Australia who would want to buy computers. This supply curve represents all computer producers in Australia. So it doesn't include computer producers overseas. This is only producers of computers in Australia. So I'll put down Australia over here. Okay, so let's assume that Australia does not have a comparative advantage in producing computers. If that is the case, should the world price be below or above our domestic price? Below, good. So we will draw, or we'll indicate that with PW. So PW, world price. Okay? So we'll draw that. So instead of a dotted line when we did gains from imports and exports, I want you to use a solid line. The reason for that is this line represents foreign supply of computers. So SF is foreign supply. And the reason why it's horizontal is because we're assuming that regardless of how much Australia wants to demand at that price, the international market can supply that. Okay, so it doesn't matter if Australia wants 1, 2, 3, 4, or 1,000 or 1,000,000 units of computers. We're assuming that the world market can satisfy that amount at that particular price. If you wanted to use terminology that you learnt last year, you would describe this as being perfectly elastic. So it's a perfectly elastic supply curve. Doesn't matter what price it is, or it doesn't matter what quantity demanded is, that supply will be met. Alright, so we're going to start off with drawing the important points before the tariff and then after the tariff, and then we're going to compare both. Alright, so first up we want to see how much domestic suppliers are willing to supply at this world price. So you have a look at where the intersection is between price and the supply curve, and that is Q1. So that's the supply curve and that's the price, and where it intersects is how much domestic producers are willing to supply. And then we have a look at where the demand curve intersects with the price, and that's where we see consumers are willing to demand. So we'll put Q2 over there. So you'd put Q1, so this is before tariff, so Q1 is quantity supplied by domestic producers and Q2 is quantity demanded by domestic consumers. Alright, but things are going to change once we introduce the tariff. Before we move on to that, I just need to describe the impact of a tariff on the world price. So remember, a tariff increases the price of imports. Okay, so that should help you kind of guess which way the world price should move. So should the world price move up or down as a result of the tariff? Up, yeah. So it just becomes more expensive for domestic consumers to purchase that import. So the actual world price doesn't change, but the price that domestic consumers in Australia faces will change because of that tax. So we are going to draw that increase in price, or at least in the effective price due to the tariff, and I'm going to use T to represent the price after the tariff, and just to make it super clear, I'll write down tariff over there. And this represents the unit amount of the tariff. So for example, if the good costs, let's just say it's the example of the Suzuki Swift, if that costs $15,000 per car and the tariff is, let's say, $1,000 per car, this vertical distance would be $1,000 because it's the unit amount applied to the price. Okay. Next, you can see straight away the intersections between the price and the demand and supply curves have changed, and you want to make sure that you put those down in your graph. So this is the new point intersecting between the supply curve and the new price with the tariff, so we'll name that Q3, and the demand curve has a new intersect point as well with the higher price, and we'll name that Q4. So that's pretty much all the labels that you need to draw, apart from the producer and consumer surplus, which we'll get to at the moment or later. So you can see some changes already. So the amount that producers are willing to supply has changed from Q1 to Q3. So that's an increase. Why are they willing to supply more? Yeah. So that was a really good point. So if the tariff were to push the price above the equilibrium, imports would stop, because there is no reason for consumers to import. They just buy it domestically. Because why would you pay a price higher than the equilibrium if you just can buy it domestically? Alright, so we've already said that Q3, so after tariff, we've already said that Q3 is the quantity supplied, so by domestic producers, and Q4 is the quantity demanded by domestic consumers. Alright, now we want to calculate changes in surplus. So first off, we're going to label each section of the graph with letters to make it easier for us to indicate what the changes are. So I'm going to do that now. As always, it doesn't really matter which letters you use, as long as you use the correct lettering in your answers. So A, B, C, D, E, F, and G. So remember, so the area between the price and the demand curve is all consumer surplus. The area between the price and the supply curve is the producer surplus. So what I want you to do now is I want you to have a go at filling out what you think the consumer surplus and producer surplus is before tariffs, and then we'll do after tariff together. So, can I get someone to please tell me what they think the consumer surplus is for the graph before tariffs? What do you think? So remember, have a look at the price before tariffs and whatever is between the demand curve and the price. Alright, Zach, go ahead. Yep, good. So A plus B plus C plus D plus E plus F. What about producer surplus? Someone else, please. Yep. G, good. So anything below the price and the supply curve. Now, after tariff, things are a bit different. You can use the same thought process though. So you want to think about the area between the price and the demand curve as the consumer surplus. So who wants to have a go at that? Yep, Matthew, go ahead.
Consumer surplus is A, B.
Yep, good. So A plus B. What about producer surplus? No? So we'll go with maybe someone on that side who hasn't spoken yet. We got Divyesh, yep. So is D, E, F within the area between the price and the supply curve? So this is the supply curve, and this is the price after tariff. Yeah, so it's C and G. Good. So now you realize, hey, wait a second, there are some areas which have not been accounted for. I will tell you what they are. So E is the government revenue derived from the tariff. The reason for that is, if you want to think of this area as a rectangle, which it is, and you want to calculate the area of the rectangle, you know from year 7 maths that it's length times width, or whatever combination that you have learnt. So the length is the amount of imports, and then the width is the price of the tariff, or the per unit price of the tariff. That's how much money the government is generating. Okay, so I would put down government tax revenue as E. But that leaves two areas which have not been accounted for still, and that is D and F. So then what's D and F? Yeah, deadweight loss. Good. So deadweight loss is D plus F. So that is the surplus, or the consumer surplus that has been given up without a corresponding increase in producer surplus. So that's the net loss in surplus as a result of a tariff. Okay. So any questions about that? Alright, so we'll end with the tariffs there, and then we're going to move on to subsidies once we discuss the impacts of a tariff in a bit more detail.